Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you are. It's breakfast somewhere, so eat up. Welcome to Breakfast with Vinny. Food for thought. So I heard this music that a live sound engineer was playing at an event when the band wasn't playing. And I thought, wow, who's that drummer? It just hit me in the gut, and I kept thinking, it sounds like the guy in the Average White Band. And so I asked the sound guy, and he says, yep, told me the record. And I knew who it was immediately. It confirmed it for me, Steve Ferroni. It got to me viscerally, probably more than a dopamine or adrenaline hit would, at least an equivalent impact. The impact of his groove really hit deep, even when he played the simplest groove in terms of note density. It actually contributed to the impact. But more than that, much more than that, was how he did it. And I knew that it was unmistakably Steve. Similarly, when I saw Elvin Jones, the very last time he did something I'd never experienced before, he played only on the ride cymbal for at least 5 minutes, nothing else. But the way that he played it and what he did was different than anything else I'd ever heard him do before. The time feel was completely different. It's as if he was reinventing time feel itself, shaping and bending time in a way that I never heard before. To the point that after the gig, I went outside, and I remember it was at the Jazz Bakery in LA. And I sat there on a bench outside by myself on the street in the dark, nobody else around. And I just stared into space with my jaw open, dumbfounded and altered by what I had just experienced. I don't say witnessed, I say experienced, because it was much more immersive. And I had contemplated it for a while, and it stuck with me. It was a monumental event and a shift in anything I'd ever experienced before, or maybe since. And it's not something that I see all the time, like something that can be easily acquired as long as there's enough focused practice with no mental or physical inhibitions. The profundity of it, and the profundity in general, is not something that can be normalized as easily. Transformative experiences are not apt to that kind of mimicry. They just aren't. And by the same token, they're not as subject to sensationalism, obviously. And analyzing it even further on a pure physical level, speaking of technique, or from a purely technical standpoint, if he had played in a way that showcased a specific technical ability that could be sensationalized or give that dopamine hit or whenever called upon, firstly, he may never have done that or thought of doing that. And secondly, if he played with a type of speed and precision of a drum corps snare drummer or anything of the like, then he could not have possibly executed his concept musically to us the way that he did. And the world would never have had the gift of Elvin Jones. Yeah, he also played loudly and used speed, but not as a focal point. Not even as a focal point that is subject to analysis of that focal point, using the kind of criteria to analyze it or justify the drug hit it induces. And third, what he did that transformed me is not something that can be normalized. Nowadays, everyone has chops and everyone focuses on speed, excessive speed, to the point that the bar can only be raised so much before it's pointless. It reminds me of people watching someone playing and saying, quote, "Look at that boy on those congo and bonga drums. You can't even see his hands move. They're so fast," end quote. It's as if that's the end all and be all. That's it. That's all that matters. That supersedes everything. That's actually the problem. Those same people wouldn't recognize brilliance in content, even if it was executed with speed, if it smacked them in their noses. If we look at the normalization of specific behaviors that are considered risque, the bar has to be continually raised because the shock value has to be increased. But at a certain point, a ceiling has been hit and there's nowhere left to go except to extreme measures that can only result in harm or even fatality. Yes, think on that for a moment. And even if we have chased that since known history, what does it mean in and of itself? Can you imagine if, even in game strategies, there was no strategy? Can you imagine if someone like Muhammad Ali didn't use his rope-a-dope or any other strategies and just tried boxing on sheer brute and maybe aimless firepower alone? Can you imagine equivalently equipped armies going to battle just relying on charging at each other with only brute force and having no military strategy. So, yeah, it could be said that many pieces of music that demand virtuosity also have a musical aesthetic. I'm not saying that they don't. I'm not saying that when sensationalism is present or the dopamine hits are serviced by pure speed, that it's exclusively separated. But I am saying that there can sometimes be a focus on that at the expense of the aesthetic. Not always, sometimes. And that it can be copied and become much more normalized to the point that everyone is doing it. And what? The bar has been raised. Therefore, the totality of musical value has increased and has benefited. To that, I say no. It hasn't. It can contribute to an extent, but those profound things that are transformative can change one forever. And while many might say that they can't be relied upon or normalized, so we can't spend our lives chasing them, of course not. But the fact that Elvin did that at all can be an indicator that he was in the moment searching for something that was profound, even as the music itself is. And therefore, that was the purpose that the entire band also had, not to impress. Yet the effect was transformative. And if anything can alter the shape of music, it's things like that. Or maybe the profound was searching for him and he just let it happen. Roy Haynes did the same thing. I saw a clip of him playing not long ago, well into his 90s, where he played a phrase, one phrase, that was so profound that I almost fell over. He could not have done that if he was including or focusing on chops or impressing people with speed alone. He just wouldn't have. And it wasn't just that phrase either. And of course, there's Miles Davis. Do you think that he, who basically reinvented music and put a huge tear into the fabric of music's space-time, did it on impressing people with speed chops or a dopamine hit? No, he didn't. Chops were included, of course, even if to play the tempos that the second great quartet played, for example. But they serviced the music. Therein lies the contextual element. The reason for being, the raison d'etre. Hint, it wasn't chops. These people were not out there primarily trying to showcase their chops. They were developing their concepts. That is a huge difference. That's why and how they changed music. Conditioning comes to mind here as our cultural values have shifted, to say the least. I've said it before, but there was a time when Frank Zappa was on a primetime TV show playing a bicycle. It was called The Steve Allen Show. Now, this may be viewed as a peculiarity that piqued people's curiosity in a novel way, somewhat akin to sensationalism, but at the same time, it exposed people to ideas that were somewhat avant-garde. That's not to say that the reason Zappa was on the show was to pique curiosity either. And also, the second great Miles Davis Quartet was also featured on that same show. Not the same episode, but the same TV show. That shows a cultural shift, to be sure. I've seen shows of people interviewing the late, great pianist Bill Evans about improvisational concepts. I've seen Leonard Bernstein interviewed as well. These were commonplace, and none of those things relied on sensationalism, speed, chops, or displays of sheer physical virtuosity for its own sake. Another huge difference. So am I spending this entire time demeaning chops? No. I would hope that it's apparent by now. But maybe it's not. I'm showing the context here, and that even though we've been subject to chasing and prone to sensationalism for millennia, is that a justification for it? Serious question. But what about classical musicians? They've been doing that for years. Again, this has been going on since time immemorial. Doesn't change anything. It just further illustrates that part of the human condition, that's all. There are a lot of other things that we have also been prone to that are actually in opposition to specific virtues that show us the high road of our lives and point to and encourage and direct us to the potentiality of the higher consciousness that we already have just because we're human in the first place. If we always obey and try to justify our limbic systems and that part of our brains, then things could get and stay chaotic. Now, I realize that there's a counterpoint to this that could go on for volumes. But again, I'm just offering another viewpoint that is what I believe to be a valuable and viable one. That's all. I mean, we can numb ourselves to almost anything else if that becomes our focus. We can't exist in a constant ecstatic peak state, for instance, no matter how much we say to ourselves, oh yeah, want to bet? Why not? Ah, too bad, etc. Or no matter how much we might joke about it either. We just can't, and we're not supposed to either. Sure, by stretching limits and striving for betterment, etc., progress can be made. I agree. I think that's also obvious to us all. Can be made. Can being the operative word there. Depends upon what is being done. But in the context of music here, we can get to a point where we realize that there is never an end to it. And at some point, if we just keep chasing that, not only will we ask ourselves why, but we might realize that we're chasing our own tails. In asking ourselves why, the answer might be to be the best, to be the fastest. And there you go. Then you realize there is no best and there is no fastest. There might be for a moment, but then there's always someone faster. This is not working. I don't know why it's doing this. Okay. Etc. And so it goes on and on and on. There's always someone faster. So it's futile, really. But again, does that mean that we should then not try to expand and progress? Of course not. But if we feel defeated, and that it's useless to go on if we don't think we're the fastest, then we're really not doing it for the right reasons in the first place. In another example, soldiers have to be taught to have a killer instinct, as we naturally as humans abhor it and shy away from it. Yet if unpunished crime becomes the norm, to those who commit them over and over, it's normalized and ever easier to do. Maybe there's a rush at first, then it just morphs into getting away with it or having some sense of power that needs to be continually fed or the thrill of constantly trying to escape. But the conscience is eroded. I'm sure you get my point. Think that's too far from the point? It's not. It's all the same. It all comes from the same place. There's an original quote attributed to the poet Juvenal in ancient Rome that says, "Give them bread and circuses, and they will never revolt." And we then have to examine how much of it is really and truly for the satisfaction of our own egos versus just expressing ourselves musically in that language. This doesn't mean that if we need to please ourselves first, that we're being egotistical. It really means that we can't second guess the audience or try to please everyone, nor should we. But that might be what we're trying to do, focusing on extremeness. But again, once it becomes normalized and everyone can do it from copying, then it's no longer extreme, and there goes the luster. Then what? Exactly. Thanks for listening. Stay tuned for the next episode of Breakfast with Vinny.